It's the future of our entire country that's at stake.
I've spent all my life campaigning for this. We all have.
On the 18th of September 2014, the people of Scotland were asked yes or no. Should Scotland be an independent country?
When the future of your country is at stake, you cannot stand back.
There was a real sort of pit in our stomach.
I have never felt any tension like it.
What is Plan B?
For some, it was fun.
I'm buzzing to see yous.
For others, ugly.
Trolling works.
Even before the campaigns were launched, both sides were fighting over who would set the referendum rules and what would be asked.
David Cameron just wanted to make it yes-no.
So I was sitting in a cafe at Venice Beach in Los Angeles, and I was reading the Los Angeles Times. It was the Saturday after the election in Scotland in 2007, and I think it must have been about the 5th page. It was some pages in on the LA Times, it was a little story, and I just said, "Scottish nationalists win." You know, I almost spat out my margarita at that point. You know, I was like, "Wow, you know, isn't that amazing?" Yeah, that was quite a day for me.
After the 2007 elections, Kirk Torrance quit his job and moved home to Scotland. He'd been an independent supporter since his student days. The SNP hadn't actually won a majority in 2007, but they'd won one more seat than Labour. It was their first chance ever to form a government.
Usually for the SNP, the election campaign is the be-all and end-all, because come election day, the SNP had lost and we just got on with our business again. It was a completely novel experience for us that at the end of an election campaign, you don't just kind of go home and get on with things again. The actual result is there's a yet bigger job to be done of, you know, actually governing Scotland.
It was exciting but quite overwhelming, and the few days after the election were a whirlwind.
Okay.
Okay, still running.
Okay. Your hair's not as bad as you're thinking, honestly, don't worry about it.
The SNP didn't have enough seats to govern on their own.
Your name and your title.
Nicola Sturgeon, SNP Deputy Leader.
And the other big parties were against a referendum.
Nicola Sturgeon, can you compromise on an independence referendum?
Well, we're inviting the Liberal Democrats to get round the table. I think there is scope for compromise, but first we have to talk to each other in the interests of the country. That's what I hope will happen. In the meantime, the SNP will make further progress, I hope, today with the Greens to try and begin the process of putting together a new government, a progressive coalition that will take Scotland forward. I suddenly became the Health Secretary. I suddenly had this team of civil servants who were eager. And then there was just a sense across government of, you know, a new broom, a new bunch of people that were keen to get things done and wanted to really set the pace.
It was quite surreal, you know, to be in that situation, the SNP to be in that situation, me personally to be in that situation for the very first time. We were actually sort of picking up the reins of government.
Inevitably, when the Nationalists formed a minority administration in 2007, there was talk of a referendum because, you know, that's what they were for, if you like.
Watch yourself, guys.
It wasn't really going to be able to be possible to get an acceptable parliamentary bill for a referendum through that Scottish Parliament because it had a massive unionist majority.
But Labour's Jim Murphy, Secretary of State for Scotland, was worried. If the SNP's momentum continued, the next Scottish elections might end up with a majority in Holyrood supporting a referendum bill.
These things are coming our way. And in politics, when there's a fast-moving vehicle coming towards you, you can't just stand still. It will hit you.
There was a discussion in Cabinet as to whether or not it might be better for the then Labour government to call that referendum.
We should call the Nationalist bluff, seize the initiative, even during the time of Labour government, and call an independence referendum and win positively.
The most important Scot in Downing Street wasn't convinced.
Well, I think it was difficult to have a referendum at a time when we had a global financial crisis. I mean, we had a global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, 2010. And I think you must not assume that if you have an SNP administration, you will inevitably have massive support for independence. And in my view, that was not inevitable.
Gordon Brown said no. And by the time the 2011 Scottish elections approached, he was out. David Cameron and the Lib Dems were in.
Oh, it's terrible for the Prime Minister.
In Scotland, the SNP were putting together a campaigning team they hoped would deliver them a majority in Holyrood.
We had a highly effective headquarters operation, and we came across a very bright, innovative young man called Kirk Torrance, who had some great new ideas on electronic campaigning.
There's a lot of excitement around how social media was going to play in the election, and so I was asked to become the party's first new media strategist.
There are three pillars to a successful movement: stories, tools, and faith. We've heard amazing...
I first came across Jim Gilliam in the United States when I was working in the film industry. Jim is an incredibly tall guy. He's bald as a result of years of chemotherapy.
I had cancer. 2 weeks into it, we found out that my mom had cancer too. I survived, she didn't. Our family was destroyed, and my faith in God was left shattered.
He's had a tremendously difficult life, but despite it all, a very enthusiastic and happy individual who feels that he's on this earth to make a social good and change the world for the better.
Welcome to Nation Builder. So what's a nation? Nation is the term we use to
In the autumn of 2010, Gilliam was developing a new internet program called Nation Builder. This could revolutionise political campaigns.
Nation Builder is a communications platform that it makes it easier for you to get information out to people, whether they're on the doorstep, on the telephone, or on the keyboard. So it just allows you to unify all your communication channels into one system to make you a lot more agile and act quicker than the opposition could. So when Jim explained it to me, I thought, wow, I need this right now. And he said it's not ready yet. It's only in alpha stage, which is a technical term for it's it's a pre-release form of a technology. And I said, I don't care. To his credit, he spent many sleepless nights getting the thing ready for us, and we worked together to get it launched in January of 2011.
And the SNP had always been an adventurous party in campaigning terms. Now, this stuff is commonplace now. It wasn't commonplace in 2011, and it gave the SNP a lead over the other parties.
Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome indeed to the launch of our 2011 election manifesto.
At the time, the iPhone had just been launched, and so everybody had a video camera in their pocket or a really nice photographic camera. So how could we utilize that? The different candidates around Scotland were armed with their mobile phones. So when they were meeting people on the doorstep and their assistants were saying, hey, would you like a picture with the candidate, Mr. Salmon, for instance? And they would upload these pictures to their personal Facebook profiles, which you started to get the sense in Scotland that, oh, Granny's an SNP voter? I didn't realise that.
Jenny Barkley here is a business unit. Hi, very nice to meet you. Thank you for having us here.
For almost 50 years, the Labour Party had dominated Scottish politics.
The Labour Party thought we would do very well in that election, I think. And we thought we could just carry the baton for another year. And there was a general sense that we were in with a real chance.
I mean, we'd gone into it expecting and hoping to be the balance of power once more, and thinking that potentially, if we did well, we'd be in an even stronger position, probably, we assumed, with the Scottish National Party.
I was just a lowly candidate for the Conservatives. I'd never been elected to any parliament. I wasn't a politician in terms of it being my actual job. So my focus had been, for the 6 weeks leading up to that and the months before, had been pounding tenement steps in a very small part of Glasgow.
The campaign was very tough.
You looking forward to the election?
Oh, yes, indeed.
Good.
What do you love? What do you love? Stornoway.
Oh, you're visiting?
That's
a great
Can I say hello? I'm Ian.
hello.
Donald Crane, he's our candidate. Oh, great. You couldn't have picked a worse fella. I'm telling you.
And the actual campaign itself was really difficult. It was very difficult because of the incident in Central Station.
We are saying the Labour Party should be against the Tory cuts.
A campaign visit to Glasgow Central Station went terribly wrong for Labour leader Ian Gray. He was ambushed by anti-austerity protesters.
You should be opposed to those cuts. I need a place for the Commonwealth government and the council. Is it not corrupt? Every single one of you.
Housing, because that's a scandal.
I've got a bit of sympathy for Ian Gray. You know, in the heat of a campaign, when there's cameras all about, people are so heavily conscious that something they're doing might be portrayed in a difficult way, etc., etc.
The picture was very powerful. It looked as if he had run away. It was very difficult to punch out of that.
I think it had been a long time coming in the sense that we had been on a trajectory of decline for really since the start of devolution.
Right, you should buy something. Right.
Right, this is...
Yeah, you go there because you're paying for it.
Throughout my political life, you know, going to a supermarket can be, you know, very rewarding, not just in terms of buying your food and all the rest of it, but people come up to you.
It has to be something Scottish, obviously. Sausages. Right, Scottish beef sausages.
I just had that sense going round Tesco's that day. Too many people, when you went into the supermarket, looked away.
Could I get a half a dozen of the Scottish beef sausages?
Truth is, if we look at it in honest terms, the SNP had become a more professional version of the Labour Party.
My broader family was all Labour, and yet my dad, who has always been that sort of, you know, red Clydeside Labour, but he was voting SNP, so that naturally led me into finding out about independence.
I'm quite a pessimist in election campaigns. I think it's because I've lost so many election campaigns that I can never quite bring myself to actually believe that we're going to win one. But I continue to have wobbles all through the campaign, and I think my colleagues will recall the final Monday of the campaign that I was phoning up sort of saying, oh no, I think it's all slipping away, which was just my natural nerves and pessimism.
In the last few weeks, it became clear that the polls were very positive for us. Our own numbers were very positive. We were beginning to get potential results in areas that we couldn't have hoped for. And in the last few days of the campaign, we actually put Alec into some quite odd places.
Well, we're working hard. I mean, we've worked hard for 4 years to earn our re-election. We're working hard till 10 o'clock on Thursday. Believe me, we're taking absolutely nothing for granted.
2011 was the first election that I was really involved with. It was the first count that I went to. I actually got the double period the next morning off school because I was still in 5th year at that point. And sitting there overnight at the count was so unbelievable that the SNP were winning seats across the west of Scotland, in Glasgow, places like Shettleston, that no one in a million years had thought they would win.
What is it? I remember, you know, listening to results in constituencies in parts of the country that I would never have dared to dream the SNP would ever win, and suddenly these seats were falling to us.
Any indication of how it's looking nationally for the Conservative vote?
The Lib Dems have had a fairly poor night, as I understand it. But our votes held pretty steady.
OK, thanks very much.
Thank you. It was only very late on in the evening that we realised that I was the only new Conservative that had been elected anywhere in the country, and that we'd lost a couple of our number.
We got absolutely battered in that election, and much else then flowed from it.
The SNP picked up 23 new seats to win a clear majority in Holyrood.
It's nothing short of a political earthquake, or perhaps that should be a political tsunami, as one SNP minister put it.
It was Scottish Labour's smallest share of the vote since 1931. The Lib Dems lost 12 of their 17 MSPs.
We're joined by the Secretary of State for Scotland, Michael Moore, a Liberal Democrat. Michael Moore, is it true?
And it was quite a lot to grapple with, emotionally quite draining, because I saw lots of my friends who had worked really hard all over Scotland were losing their seats. They were out of a job, and it's pretty brutal in politics.
Do these results say that Scotland wants to be an independent country?
He was in a great mood, overlooking all the constituencies. He said, you know, look, Jeff, we've won that one, we've won that one. And then the next time he was like, I can't get hold of anyone at HQ, you know, and it was typical Alex Salmond, of course, never happy.
Yeah, I mean, I probably did that sort of, you know, outrageous thing of taking some time to say to a team that were exhausted because they just, you know, helped us win this historic election. Thank you for that. And no doubt Alec was getting irate because he wanted to, you know, give them some orders for what they had to do next.
There is a parliamentary majority for an independence referendum, and then the excitement of that suddenly dawned as well. But nobody thought that the electoral system could be broken in the way that it was, and when it was, we knew that the possibility of a referendum was real.
Later this evening I'll be speaking to the Prime Minister and laying down markers as to what this result, what this mandate means in terms of Scotland's relationship with the United Kingdom.
David was quite happy to speak, but there wasn't much business done. I mean, he said something like, we have to be aware of the election result, which was a clear signal that he wasn't going to resist the concept of a referendum. But remember, there's a huge difference between saying, oh, well, we'll have a referendum, and then actually how that referendum is pursued. In referendum, like life, the devil is in the detail.
Within days of the elections in Scotland, the Quad, 4 key members of the UK Cabinet, 2 Conservative and 2 Liberal Democrat, called in the Scottish Secretary for an emergency session.
I was struck by the fact that it wasn't just 4 people. The room was probably busier than for a cabinet meeting by the time you added in special advisors, communications experts, civil servants and the like. I realised that the role I was playing and that the coalition was going to play vis-à-vis Scotland had been transformed. We would have to respond to this, and it brought Scotland to the heart of consideration at the Quad for the very first time.
I remember at that meeting, George Osborne arrived late and said, sort of half seriously, half jokingly, well, can't we just run the referendum from London? You know, that's what they would do in Spain.
The Spanish example was of a government that takes a hard line against independence movements. George Osborne was hinting that Westminster would have control of any referendum process.
For all the kind of joshing and joviality of a team that was working pretty closely together in coalition by that point, we were faced with a deadly serious question about the future of our country.
However he meant it, it was considered. And it took people like me and others to push back and say, we will have to find a solution that is made in Scotland. If we don't, if we try and do it from London, we'll lose.
We were firmly of the view that any approach to the referendum, above and beyond anything else, needed to avoid the trap of feeding the grievance narrative, the blame narrative, which the SNP and Alex Salmond were so successful at sort of harvesting and deploying.
I think there was an expectation that the meeting would have concluded around, let's take control, we're going to examine how we would do that. It was clear from the way that I and some of my colleagues argued our case that it wasn't just going to be a slam dunk.
You know, I'm not from Scotland. We had to make sure that we were taking on board Scottish opinion, and that included Scottish members of our own government.
They were going to have to work on some serious figures in the cabinet, figures like Ken Clarke and Michael Gove and others who were going, hang on, what on earth are we thinking of doing here?
For the next year and a half, David Cameron and George Osborne would search for a new way to keep their Liberal Democrat partners on board without losing the support of the Conservative Party, and somehow hold a referendum in Scotland that would end up with the Union intact.
Joanne Lamont is elected as leader of the Scottish...
While Cameron tried to convince the Conservatives, the three pro-union parties looked for new leaders in Scotland.
Once all the runners and riders were declared, it became known that David Cameron as leader, other significant players in the party, were backing Ruth, even if they were adopting something of a position of public neutrality on the issue.
Here was this person who was the very opposite of your sort of classic Scottish Tory, you know, from some sort of landed estate, you know, this elderly gentleman.
The successful candidate is Ruth Davidson, MSP, and accordingly I have very much pleasure in declaring Ruth Davidson the duly elected leader of the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party.
Here was this young woman, a lesbian, worked at the BBC, dynamic, knew her own mind. She was such a breath of fresh air.
We were at our lowest ebb. We had our least number of political representatives, least amount of money, the least amount of direction. We were considered a joke. And actually the referendum helped us pull together as a party.
A lot of people got quite frustrated for having a kind of lengthy period where the Scottish politics seemed to be about, not even about the arguments for or against independence in terms of the referendum, but the arguments about the terms of the referendum. It was a debate about a process, if you like.
Tonight, we're in Aberdeen, and welcome to Question Time. With me on our panel here, the First Minister of Scotland, Alex Salmond, from the Cabinet, the Liberal Democrat Scottish Secretary, Michael Moore, the last Conservative Secretary of State for Scotland, Michael Forsyth.
6 weeks after those Holyrood elections, the referendum seemed as far away as ever.
A question, please, from Ian Morgan.
If the SNP are so confident the people of Scotland want independence, why not set a date for the vote?
It seems to be one for you, Alex Salmond. If you're so confident the people of Scotland want independence, why not set the date?
Well, I suppose because during the election campaign of a few weeks ago, when asked when the referendum should be, I said towards the end of the parliamentary term, well into the second half of the term. Now, given that just occasionally politicians are criticised for not doing what they said in election campaigns, I thought I would provide a refreshing change.
I think that's a load of balderdash. I mean, the reason that Alex doesn't want to set a date is because he knows if he had a referendum now he'd lose it.
Could not Westminster and the coalition government...
We could.
You could instigate a referendum, couldn't you?
Well, actually, Alex doesn't have the power in the Scottish Parliament to create a binding referendum.
So why are you blaming him? Yeah. Westminster could do it.
because
I think Salmond, who was a bit nervous of finally being confronted with a thing that he had been talking about all his life, was looking for some kind of road out where you could have a three-way referendum and, you know, lots of different questions on a ballot paper.
David Cameron was looking at polls that suggested if a yes-no referendum were held immediately, Scotland would vote to stay in the UK by a comfortable margin. He wanted the referendum soon, even if Westminster had to run it.
I sat in a small meeting with the Prime Minister and with Ed Miliband, where Cameron was very candid about this in conversation, where he said, ultimately, I don't believe that Alex Salmond wants to have this referendum because it's a foolish strategy to have a referendum that you think you will lose. This must be dealt with somehow, and that may very well be Westminster, because I don't believe that Alex Salmond will engage in this game. I think it's fair to say that Ed Miliband reacted with what one might call extreme caution. He looked very, very uncomfortable, but the purpose was to try and make sure that the Labour Party was as engaged as possible so that there was a united front.
David Cameron's strategy was based on the assumption that the SNP would read the polls in the same way he did and would try to avoid holding an independence referendum.
Westminster politicians have never understood us. They've never got it. They've never really been able to come to terms with the fact that there is this thing that we actually believe in, and we've thought about it, and we believe in it because we think it's right for the country, and we're prepared to take risks occasionally in pursuit of it. And they never got that. And this idea, I've heard that said before, that secretly we didn't want the referendum. You know, I've spent all my life campaigning for this. We all have.
There was just the belief that Scotland should be an independent country, and that essentially just drove me and drove, you know, the rest of the group, the rest of the team. And so it wasn't a sense of believing that it might happen, but there was just a sense that we had to be doing this.
Just after the 2012 New Year, the UK government was ready to reveal their plans to push for a legally binding referendum with only one question. On the second Sunday of the month, David Cameron announced his government's agenda.
We'll be setting out clearly what the legal situation is, and I think then we need to move forward and say, right, let's settle this issue in a fair and decisive way.
And just on the timing, he's also apparently wants to have this vote in 2014, the anniversary of the Great Battle of Bannockburn, when lots of people called Cameron defeated lots of people called Osborne or something like that. But at any rate, he would like it to be 2014. You are saying, no, let's have the vote earlier.
Well, I think this is a matter for the Scottish people.
Oh, it is.
And if there are problems of uncertainty and lack of clarity, and I don't think we should just let this go on year after year.
The next day, the Prime Minister led his entire cabinet to East London for an away day.
We actually went to a cabinet meeting at the Olympics site in January 2012, and along with the Chancellor, I presented the strategy that we were to follow. By the time we got to the cabinet meeting, the Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, Chancellor, all of us were clear what we were doing.
We were saying to Alex Salmond, you can have your referendum, but it's going to be a decisive referendum. You're not going to wriggle off the hook.
Is it bring it on to Scotland?
It is, no, it is, look, we've set out very clearly that we're making, actually making sure that people in Scotland can determine their own future. It's for them to do that, and the British government, quite rightly, is responding to that desire.
My first week in the job, I said to the Prime Minister, I think we need to get some urgency into this. And I suggested he went to Scotland, say to Alex Salmond, look, I think we can get all this thing wrapped up by October.
The glorious rule.
For all his confidence about how to run things, he was very self-aware that an English Conservative telling Scotland what to do was not going to work.
I know the Conservative Party isn't currently, how can I put this, Scotland's most influential political movement. I'm often reminded that I've been more successful in helping to get pandas to the zoo than Conservative MPs elected in Scotland.
And then we went to see Alex Salmond with huge crowds of protesters outside St Andrew's House. The police had been unable to clear away, so we ended up going in the underground entrance.
The demonstrators had nothing to do with the referendum. They were protesting against Cameron's austerity policies.
I didn't organise the demonstration organised itself. But I have to confess it wasn't entirely inconvenient to be holding a meeting with the Prime Minister where audibly coming through the window, the closed window, was the cries of the demonstrators suggesting that perhaps his policies could do with a little bit of changing.
The Prime Minister was obviously very wary when he was in a meeting with Alex Salmond.
Well, I can't imagine why I would make the Prime Minister nervous, I don't know.
The Prime Minister used to joke, you know, feel your pockets to see if you've still got your wallet when you leave the meeting.
It was an interesting dynamic in the meetings, of course, because Alec had a bit of a fair conceit of himself, and there was no suggestion that he was the lesser of the two. He was giving as good as he got in the discussions, as he always did, of course.
If you're having a referendum, then one thing that has to happen is that referendum has to be made in Scotland. It has to be built in Scotland. The idea of a hand-me-down referendum from Westminster, it's an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms. You can't give people self-determination. They have to earn it, to win it, to vote for it. These were our priorities. Cameron's priority, David Cameron just wanted to make it yes-no.
What we didn't want was the Prime Minister exposed to the charge that he hadn't engaged on the issue with the First Minister, that he hadn't engaged in the debate in Scotland, but he was very clear that he was not to be the figurehead of this.
The coalition had agreed to negotiate terms for a binding referendum that would be run by the Scottish Government. Now, both sides knew they needed campaign teams.
I went round my own party, I talked to the other political parties, and I said, look, what's happening? Where's the campaign? And what was worrying me was there wasn't one. I mean, I asked just about everybody there was to ask, will you run it? Because I wanted it to be a Labour-run umbrella campaign, for obvious reasons. But nobody really wanted to.
Well, I had no real desire to return to frontline politics or to political speeches. I had done what I thought was the right thing to do, to withdraw after 2010.
But the former Prime Minister was anxious to shape events behind the scenes.
I went to see David Cameron and George Osborne together. I think it was the day before the budget in 2012, because I remember thinking, why is George Osborne not thinking about his budget rather than thinking, as I was asking him to do, about Scotland on this particular day?
Of course, it was an extraordinary meeting because both myself, I'd been the shadow Chancellor when Gordon Brown had been Chancellor, David Cameron had been Leader of the Opposition when Gordon had been Prime Minister, and we had been the bitterest of political enemies. I don't think Gordon does cross-party, really.
I think they understood that they didn't understand better than the people in Scotland what was happening. And I said to them, look, this cannot be a campaign between Britain and Scotland. If you're having a referendum, you must not allow the Scottish National Party to present themselves as the only champions of Scotland and leave you as the champions of Britain, and the SNP will say against Scotland.
Well, Gordon's idea was that the Labour Party should be put in charge of the campaign and the Tory Party should fund it.
And I said to them, look, half the money should go to the Labour campaign, and Labour should have a distinctive campaign while part of the umbrella campaign, and I supported that, but you had to have a distinctive Labour campaign. Labour was best equipped to get this message across.
Now, I don't think that was a pretty sensible idea, frankly, because you needed a broad range of Scottish opinion. You needed to show it was a cross-party campaign.
Sometimes what happens in politics, you can't always get agreement between the parties, even when agreement seems to make sense.
Gordon Brown refused to join a cross-party campaign against independence in 2012. On the other side, the case for yes was already being made.
Thank you very much. We were coming from, at best, 30%, and some polls didn't even show that. And I always believed we could get there, but you had to have time to do it.
For me, this is what I've been working for all my life, so there was a real excitement about the possibility of having the referendum. The research that we had told us very clearly that people were open to the idea of independence, but they weren't at that stage ready to say yes to independence. So we knew that in order to get from where we were to where we needed to be, we had to have a very sort of slow and gradual process of conversion. So the primary argument I made was we need to go sooner rather than later.
You were up against an extremely well-oiled, well-drilled, well-honed nationalist party and campaign on the other side. But I thought there's no way you can win a referendum like this on a sort of amateurish, hope for the best, something will turn up with the night sort of approach. This was about the future of my country. It was the future of Scotland. And I was damned if I was going to let it just wither away simply because nobody
wanted to do it in particular. So, you know, to coin the old phrase, you want something, do it yourself.
Alistair Darling agreed to head up a cross-party campaign. The plan was to use Labour activists on the ground, while the Conservatives would tap their donors. David Cameron's favourite strategist and pollster would provide key insights into the Scottish electorate.
Before I got involved in this campaign, actually, I'd never really been to Scotland, certainly never really explored the country. And I then, of course, came to spend a lot of time there, spent a lot of time going around Scotland, doing focus groups, listening to voters. Got a very clear sense immediately of this distinctiveness of Scotland's sort of identity and the pride in its heritage and in its difference that I hadn't expected, and which really underlined why so many people in Scotland were so drawn to the idea and felt that it seemed so natural an idea that Scotland should be an independent country.
In the spring of 2012, a campaign team from all three pro-union parties, the Liberal Democrats, Labour and the Conservatives, got together for the first time.
We arrived in Alistair Darling's house in Morningside in Edinburgh, and laid out in the kitchen was a vast array of fantastic home baking that had been done by Maggie Darling. And I think that set the tone for what was the first meeting that we had, breaking the ice.
It was peculiar, it really was peculiar, because in so many different ways, you just come from a completely different political philosophy. And so here were these three political philosophies in the one room, and this group of personalities, stroke egos, in the one room. And to some extent, the achievement of that first meeting was that it took place at all.
The first time we met in my house was to, get a structure organised, to organise, who was doing what, but also to get the first polling. And that's not just asking, the sort of polls, how are you going to vote if there was voting an election tomorrow morning. It was to understand why people were forming a view in the way that they were.
The No team was shown a picture of Scotland that was more complicated than the double-digit lead No enjoyed in the public polls.
I did a lot of focus groups where we're getting together 8 or 10 people at a time, spending a couple of hours really probing their attitudes.
Scotland was basically divided into three camps. There were those who were committed to Scotland's future within the United Kingdom, there were those who were committed to independence come what may, and critically there was a middle third of voters.
Winning these undecided voters was the key to victory for both No and Yes.
Critically, what Andrew's research revealed was that those middle voters were not equidistant between No and Yes.
They weren't willing to say yes to independence, but their hearts were very close to it. More than 3/4 of them said that their feeling about the referendum was summed up by the phrase, "My heart says I want independence for Scotland, but my head says it may be too risky." And we concluded that with the time and resources we had available, the sort of central thrust of the campaign strategy had to be to focus on the risks, because it was only those risks which were stopping them from being yes voters.
I was very clear that the economic argument was their Achilles heel.
About a month before Yes Scotland launched, I was at a cultural event, and afterwards a chap approached me whom I knew a bit. A nice guy, very much from an establishment Scotland, elite Scotland sort of background, and he approached me in a slightly discreet way and said, Blair, there's a group of us meeting at my house next week to think about how we see off this independence nonsense, and we'd be delighted if you were able to join us. And I said, well, I'm terribly sorry, but thank you for the invitation, but come referendum day, I'll be voting yes. And there was a look of horror crossed his face. And then I had a meeting with somebody I knew in the SNP, and they were picking my brains about broadcasting issues. And I found myself saying, okay, well, I'm not in the party. If you set up a genuinely all parties and no parties, big umbrella campaign for independence, I will speak in support. of a yes vote.
We had our Scottish Greens Spring Conference. Couldn't really call it a conference. There were maybe 40 people in a room in Perth.
Many of whom will want to be hearing what kind of independent Scotland or what kind of future Scotland do we envisage.
Patrick Harvey produced a letter. It was from Alex Salmond, and it was inviting the Greens to the launch of the Yes campaign, Yes Scotland, and to be part of that.
I will be voting for both motions because I think it gives us the flexibility to develop our own campaign if we can, but without Yes Scotland, we lose a huge ability to talk about green issues to the public in a way that they'll have never experienced before.
There was more than a frustration that we felt like we were being treated as an afterthought. We should have been involved in organising this. We should have been involved in deciding what the Yes campaign would look like, what its launch would look like, rather than be invited to it as guests. There was also a little bit of frustration at the Yes declaration that had been drafted, that we asked all supporters of independence to sign up to, that it referred to Scotland as a she. And the Green Party actually, we believe in avoiding gender binaries wherever possible. So you don't refer to the country as he or she, the country is a they. And odd little things like that that we would have been easily able to avoid if we had just been involved in this a bit sooner.
My wife and I were in America on holiday, and I got a phone call saying, oh, you remember you said you would speak in favour of Yes? Well, we're having the launch a week on Friday. Can you be in Edinburgh? So I only had one question really, which was, okay, who else is speaking? You know, is this genuinely all parties, and who else is speaking? And when I heard the list of names of people who were going to be speaking, I agreed to say something.
This is a great day, and I believe there are even better days to come. I want to tell you why I believe in an independent Scotland.
Among the guests were lottery winners Colin and Chris Weir, who would give the Yes campaign £1 million in its first year.
At that stage, we had a bigger budget, we had nicer cameras, we had lights, we had production crew, and we had many celebrities. So the idea was that we'd get celebrity interviews, lots of photographs, and generate as much nice-looking content as possible, just to replicate what we'd been doing during the political campaigns, but now within the sort of Yes Scotland stable.
I don't know if you can see the changes that have come over.
I sincerely believe that it is fundamentally better for us all if decisions about Scotland's future are taken by the people who care most about Scotland, and that is the Scottish people.
You know, I don't believe we're better than any other country in the UK, or the world for that matter, but I do believe we're equal.
So far away today.
We have arrived at the moment to realise our potential. Please, let's not waste it. Let's say yes.
Caledonia's been everything I've ever
The thing that I hadn't anticipated was how much pent-up energy there was in the country among Yes campaigners, SNP campaigners. And so in those first few weeks after the launch, when we thought we'd have a bit of breathing space to set things up, there was just this avalanche of demand, and it was overwhelming.
To be honest, when I started, there was a couple of people working in a tiny office in Edinburgh, and there was a website, and that was about it, really.
It was quite a scary time in the sense of just how much activity there was. The phones were ringing off the hook. People's email inboxes were overflowing. I think the server crashed at one time in terms of the amount of traffic going to the website.
You know, we didn't even have a leaflet for a couple of months.
After the Yes campaign had launched, they had lots of celebrities, lots of glitz and glamour, and I think it was one evening at home feeding my daughter. I realised that we were never going to be the most interesting campaign.
Do we know how many people there are?
I was paying for the launch event and for all the various things needed doing on a credit card, so it was, it felt like a bit of a precarious existence. My suggestion was that we should base the launch around ordinary Scots.
Your boyfriend's preparing to be an army officer, is that right?
He is, yes. My boyfriend is down at Sandhurst at the moment. He is going through his training to become an officer in the British Army. And I think I'll speak for everyone when I say how immensely proud I am of our armed forces.
Absolutely, yes.
So we spent a sort of breathless few weeks going all the way around Scotland, identifying hundreds of everyday people with distinctive, interesting stories. And we filmed those stories and we built our whole launch around it.
Take great pride in building these ships for the UK and watching those ships getting built, like getting them launched and then delivered and seeing them. When I see them on television sometimes nowadays, I can tell my kids, your dad built that, your dad helped to build that, and your dad helped to put that in the waters. The same as the rest of the guys in the shipyards have done as well. We'd hate to see that go.
A lot of them obviously were people who knew Labour politicians or Conservative politicians, but they themselves were not political. Although one of them was my father-in-law, who I think if I hadn't included him in the launch, I don't think I'd have been welcome back home.
We had to explain why we were working together, the argument that if you agree with people, then you should come together and make your case. I wanted a name that tripped off the tongue, or something you might say in conversation.
There were only ever really two serious contenders for the name of the campaign, Stronger Together and Better Together, and we tested them in the polling, and they both tested pretty well. And actually my recollection is that it was Alistair Darling who at that point stepped in and said he had a strong preference and that Better Together was better.
My argument was, we're better together, and that was it.
It's a massive decision, and there will be no going back. It will affect not just us, but the opportunities of future generations.
We don't need to leave the UK to be Scottish. We can have the best of both worlds.
We want the best of both worlds.
So let's not leave. We're better together.
Two campaigns had been launched, slogans and logos unveiled. But there was no date for the referendum, no rules set, and no agreement on what question was going to be asked.
Should this be a binary question, or should there be a second question? And Alex Salmond was pushing very hard, at least publicly, that there should be a second question.
The second question would be for Devo Max, to give the Scottish Parliament almost complete control over tax and spending, but to stay in the UK.
There was and always had been a body of opinion in the party, the movement more generally, that a multi-option referendum could be the right thing to do.
We didn't like that at all. So our number one red line was we wanted a single question.
But by the time we were at this phase of things, we were of the view that a single question, straight choice, yes or no to independence, was the right thing to do. So there was a lot of negotiating tactics at play.
If you want somebody in politics, particularly a powerful government, to do something that they don't want to do, then often what you have to do is present them with something which is even less palatable to them, so that they can say, oh, well, no, it's not as bad as a free referendum. And Cameron was like that.
The defining moment was when the First Minister appointed Nicola Sturgeon to be the Constitution Minister, because that was a game changer. I issued an invitation to her to come to the Scotland office and let's get serious about the talks, which she accepted.
At that point, I wanted to get to a conclusion of the negotiation. There'd been lots of shadow boxing for months before that, and that was partly deliberate on both sides.
The first time I met Nicola was as a fellow young politician. The BBC interviewed us about the state of Scottish politics and the future.
People don't want to separate for England. That is not the answer.
And Nicola turned up very serious and with a folder under our arm.
While in England the Labour Party is doing supposedly well at the moment, in Scotland the Labour Party is actually doing not as well as it's done in the past. It's the SNP who are making the advances in Scottish politics.
I should have taken much more note of that at the time, because that wasn't the last time that she beat me in a television debate.
Early in the autumn of 2012, Michael Moore and Nicola Sturgeon quietly met in the Scotland Office building in Edinburgh to try and break the impasse over 1 versus 2 questions.
When she arrived, rather than walking straight into a set-piece negotiation, let's go and have 10 minutes chatting about this.
I'm not sure if Michael and I have ever actually spoken about this, but I took in 2 sort of big ring binders full of papers. And I think one of them probably didn't have any papers relevant to the meeting, and it was all sort of to give the impression that I was absolutely on top of this.
So we actually disappeared for the best part of half an hour, and just the two of us talking to one another. I guess we were assessing each other's bona fides. Were we seriously here to negotiate?
We wanted no strings attached, so we wanted to make sure that in terms of the franchise, we had a free hand, and given the vote to 16 and 17-year-olds was something, as a matter of principle, that we were absolutely determined that we wanted to do. And in terms of the legislation for the referendum and making sure that the rules around that were set by the Scottish Parliament.
The big issue for us, which was about a single question in the referendum, was probably resolved. Everything was left as nothing's agreed until everything's agreed, but by the time we went down into the formal negotiation, I was, to myself, pretty confident that while there was a lot to get through, we could get to the other side.
I think both of us knew at that point that barring something unforeseen, we were going to get to an agreement.
First Minister, how are you feeling today?
The Scottish Government got almost everything they wanted for the referendum. Control over the timing, the vote for 16 to 17-year-olds, and first crack at the wording of the question. All in return for giving up on a second question they say they didn't really want.
Is this an historic day for Scotland?
We were leaving a lot of the detail to the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government. And therefore, we wanted a very public event, launch event, the signing, to, as I say, keep the Scottish Government honest,
And the plan was that the Prime Minister was doing other visits, and I would basically, my car, we would join his convoy on the approach to St Andrew's House.
And everything's timed, of course, and there's the choreography that's done, and the recce will have been done by, the blokes with the earpieces and everything else, and the cameras will be in position. And Michael Moore, car trouble.
The car that I was in broke down on the approach to St Andrew's House, and the driver said, let's push it backwards so that we can get it started again. I wasn't sure this was a great idea. And moments later was convinced it wasn't a good idea, because by that stage the car was now at right angles to the direction that the Prime Minister.
So, to the outside world, this was the meeting that was going to do the deal. In effect, the deal had already been done. So we got in there, and, everybody sort of looked around and said, well, what do we do now? We can't go out, and, after about sort of 5 minutes. So there was a lots of, I think we stayed in there, happily chatting for a period of time.
Well, you haven't fallen into that. No, but I'm absolutely hammered, because you think you're well prepared, and then suddenly it's that.
For every kind of visit, you have a sort of advanced teams, and there was lots of haggling.
Right.
Alex Salmond wanted to have in shot for the signing a map of Scotland that showed Scotland had turned SNP yellow.
Right. Switch. I can do it. Thank you very much.
Once the ceremonial was done, the Prime Minister gave a few interviews.
Happy? Promise? I thought you were doing a sort of family photo. I thought I'd better let that happen and then we can get on with the interview.
And then he was back in the car and off back to London. First Minister, Deputy First Minister had a huge set-piece media event.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I should also say good afternoon to the journalists in the overspill room. I'm delighted to say that this agreement, let's call it the Edinburgh Agreement.
We were watching that in the hotel across the road. I could feel officials and press people getting really agitated. It's not the Edinburgh Agreement. We had some long, convoluted thing. And I just said, look, guys, it's the Edinburgh Agreement. Let us not have a battle over this. We have got to a great place. We have succeeded in getting our legal, fair and decisive referendum, what we set out to do a year and or so ago. Let's celebrate that fact. And we were pleased. It meant that process was off the agenda. Let's get on to the real issues.
The campaign was on. Nicola Sturgeon went to Strathclyde University to make a case for independence to voters who didn't think of themselves as nationalists.
My conviction that Scotland should be independent stems from the principles not of identity or nationality, but of democracy and social justice.
It's not really about national identity in that sense. It's about giving Scotland the powers of self-government that independent countries take for granted to build a better and a fairer country.
You've got to see the world through, the opposition's eyes. And of course I can see the argument, that people hold for one reason or another that, Scotland should be independent. Equally, I still believe that, it is in Scotland's interest to remain part of the United Kingdom.
Our referendum in the autumn of 2014 may be asking only one question, but in truth Scotland faces two choices. The first choice is whether to bring the powers home to govern ourselves rather than stick with UK governance. And the second choice is what kind of society do we want to be? But we don't get to make the second choice without being prepared to make the first.
Through that argument, we were able to bring onto the yes side people who would never describe themselves as nationalists.
Part of the campaign was to persuade those people who thought independence, was a kind of rather airy-fairy romantic idea and might be a good thing, that there were real-world consequences for them and their families and for their country if they went down that path.
The reason that I kept on an economic argument from the start to the finish is because that is the thing that was going to make the difference between us winning or not.
Next time.
I remember on that day thinking, we've got a mountain to climb.
But all of a sudden, the governor's speech had been reinterpreted.
He was not universally popular in Scotland.
They decide.
Someone emailed me and said, you've gone viral.
You were more the object of hatred.
I was the object of hatred.
Because of your father-in-law.
Independence will make us more susceptible to attacks from outer space.
When he started asking about spacemen, I thought he's lost the plot.